Thank you. Guys, I am so happy I'm the one who gets to talk to Tom today. He is the CEO of Terra Group and a senior advisor for Target Smart. One of the things that you have to do as we're sort of digesting all this information, it has to be somebody that you trust. And we trust Tom. And even with his fresh new haircut, we trust Tom. So I'm going to get serious because I have been dying to have this conversation, and you're so gracious to always accommodate us when we're trying to really get smarter and be big thinkers. But the very first question I'll ask before I ask you sort of set the stage for everyone is to know that my second question is going to be, where are the 19 million people and who are they? But I will let you sort of think about that for a minute, but just sort of lay the groundwork for everybody who's here today in terms of how the data, based on what you have so far, tells us about this election.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's good to be here with y'all. I've always found it at least somewhat therapeutic to be with this group, especially after tough times. And I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to join this group several times. So it's good to be here at the end of this trying week to be able to talk about the data. So yeah, we have lots of data now. One of the challenges that we have around elections is the speed at which we can understand what happened in the election versus the speed at which we desire to know what happened are two very different velocities. And so what we've seen is, the election happened. There were some immediate levels of shock, and then some immediate theories about what happened. And there's a lot of what we've been hearing since then, where we talk about this state swung this way, this state swung that way, these voters swung this way, these voters swung that way. And we'll talk about that as we get into this question of the 19 million voters. But to really know, what we need to do is get all the data of who actually voted, and that takes time. Different states work at different cadences. We're finally at the point, literally as of this morning, where we now have the turnout data for all of the battleground states and for most of the 50 states plus the District of Columbia. And so it's literally, this is the first time I'm talking with anyone about this.
Yay.
Actually have this full picture. But that's individual level turnout data where we can look. And of course, we don't know for whom people voted, though we can intuit a fair amount from the data we have. But we know who voted. And so we can, if it's an algebraic equation, we can at least fill in or solve for one side of the equation by knowing what turnout looked like. And by having that, it starts to tell us a lot about this election. And the reason, in my mind, why this is important and why I can hopefully pitch this group on this is, I think the one truth that we could all agree upon is that there's a lot of work to be done. That what we didn't work, that we missed some things, and that we need to do better. And the only way we can set off on that path is if we choose the right path and we have the right map and we have an accurate sense of what happened, how and why, what went wrong. And so we're just getting that now. And, there's this ongoing debate about turnout versus persuasion. And, we actually now have the data. So we can get into that second question, because I think that's really key to understanding all of this.
Yeah, and before you get started, there are folks on this call who one of the things that they are always, questioning is, where do we start? And we always want to, at least for me, I always want to start with the people who didn't show up. I mean, when I look at my voting data, I want to look at it and I go, oh, well, here's this group of people who didn't show up. So I think I'm wondering if there's some of the 19 million. So I want to hear that, and then hopefully you'll be able to tell us what kind of things you all have been sort of piecing together to say, oh, this is a 19 million, what we might do next.
Yeah. So, and for those who aren't up to speed on this, and I actually hadn't read the specific post that that you reference in the 19 million from Mike Podhorzer, who's a brilliant analyst, and I imagine most of you are familiar with. But Fennell, you shared that with me just a couple of days ago, and so I had the opportunity to read it, and it's a really astute analysis. And basically, the point that Mike was making in this analysis was that he estimates that there are about 19 million Biden voters, people who turned out and voted for President Biden in 2020, who didn't vote at all in 2024. And his point is, which I very much agree with, is if we want to understand what happened, we have to answer the question of who are these people and where they went. And we have to understand, and he talks about flatlands versus 3D. If you haven't seen, if you haven't read his post, I recommend it. And then Catherine shared with me an actual podcast video interview with him yesterday that I recommend, with the people from Way to Win. Wonderful interview where he goes into it more depth. I recommend. It's relatively brief as far as podcasts go, but he talks about, in order to understand what happened, you have to consider persuasion and turnout. And when we talk about a group swinging away, we all internalize it as, well, these people used to be with us and now they're not. They voted for Biden last time, they didn't this time. And no doubt there were a number of those voters in this election. But when we talk about groups and states swinging, as we are finding in the data, and as this 19 million voter estimate would suggest, a huge portion of the swing from a victorious election in 2020 to falling short in 2024 was Democrats staying home. And as we look at the vote history data, as I said, we have the first look at all the battleground states as of this morning now. I can confirm for you that is what happened. I will say this: the 19 million vote number is a huge number. It's huge. Mm-hmm. Most of those voters, not just in terms of, look, there were 7 battleground states and then 43, 44 non-battleground states. So obviously most of them were in the non-battleground states. But even when you look at a proportion of the state, Democratic turnout was better in the battleground states than it was outside. That's an important point to make, but it wasn't good enough. So there still was a drop off. So if you think about the states that swung the most towards Republicans, towards Trump between 2020 and 2024, there are states that I don't think most people would have predicted. States like Maryland, where I am, New Jersey, Massachusetts, New York, blue states. And so you look at that and you say, again, I think a lot of people drew the conclusion that, well, it was woke Democrats. We were too woke. That the people in these states that have, quote, blue leadership were turned off by how woke Democrats were, and so they flocked to Trump. Well, now that we have the turnout data, I can tell you, no, they stayed home. They didn't flock anywhere. And look, that, I'm not saying that to excuse anything or to make anyone feel better about anything. That's something that should be troubling to all of us. It's a question we have to answer: is why did they stay home? Why did they not internalize the consequences? And I hope we can get into that in this conversation, because I think it's important. Again, the same thing happened in the battleground states, but it was much smaller. But there was one other key component of this, of why you had this bigger, this drop off, was voter registration. I looked at the Pennsylvania data this morning, and you look at the differences in turnout between 2020 and 2024. More people voted in Pennsylvania in 2024 than voted in 2020, first of all. That was something that on election night, and actually in most of the battleground states, raw turnout, total votes cast, was higher than 2020. Turnout as a percent of eligible population didn't quite keep up. So overall turnout in Pennsylvania was down by a fraction of a percent relative to 2020 when you look at registered voters.
So, Tom, let me just ask a really quick question, because I know this is probably is bugging Catherine. And that is all of the stuff that Elon Musk was doing in terms of getting people to come up. Do you think that had any impact on what you're saying now about, registration and people turning out?
Maybe, maybe, and in the margins. But when you look at it, it wasn't just, Elon Musk engaged in the last several months few months in Pennsylvania. But when you look at the long tail, Democratic registration actually dropped in Pennsylvania over the 4-year period from 2020 to 24 by about 140,000, dropped 140,000 fewer Democrats. Republican registration increased by almost 200,000. And so, yes, Elon Musk was registering voters. He was paying people off with this $1 million bounty or whatever. So that appears to have had an effect. But this is something that started years ago, right after the 2020 election, and just sort of continued throughout. So to me, it speaks to a larger challenge among the Democratic Party and how we talk about our accomplishments. And that, I will say this, I think President Biden was an incredibly good and successful president. And I do believe that history will smile upon his presidency for the accomplishments that he had, which were many, especially given the partisanship and the narrowly divided Congress while he was president. But we as Democrats didn't talk about it. We didn't engage in these spaces where Republicans were engaging. And so people didn't think that. They didn't believe that to be true. And you see that in the data. Here's another sort of challenging of conventional wisdom that I'll throw out there that's apparent in the data. Pennsylvania added automatic voter registration, which is something that we as Democrats and progressives have been pushing for. And I don't want to say this is something that, we should throw this out, because I believe in greater participation. But what you see in the data is when you have the combination of Democrats not entering in the conversation and contesting how people perceive the parties and how they perceived Democratic leadership, and you add in automatic voter registration, Republicans took substantial advantage of automatic voter registration. So the net effect of automatic voter registration in Pennsylvania was incredibly negative for Democrats. So in the end, Democratic turnout dropped by only a point in Pennsylvania between 2020 and 2024. Republican turnout dropped by 0.6 of a point. So that 0.4 of a point difference shouldn't have made that much of a difference. But here's the problem. Like I said, the registration number shifted enough that they added enough and we dropped enough that you had about a 3.5 point swing in the state from Biden to Harris. And that was it. That was the story.
So I have a question about that registration. And so here's my question, because I'm trying to figure out, and maybe this will be later, who these people were who started to register for Republicans. And so will you all have demographic data
Yes.
to sort of help show us? Because I think what I'd ask is, in terms of that demographic data, should tell us what our story should be that we're talking to people about, when and where and how and who.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting, and let's talk about Pennsylvania a little bit longer, because
Okay.
I think it's indicative of the battleground states in general. And what I'm about to say about Pennsylvania is generally true across the battleground states.
Okay.
Pennsylvania is just a good example because they have partisan registration. It's always a tightly contested state. And when you look at the registration and you look at the turnout data, and again, if we remember that the baseline was turnout was actually very close to 2020 in terms of percent of registration. So we're just talking about minor changes. If you look at Democrats, the biggest drops in turnout were among voters under 30, men and women. Slightly more men than women. Democrats over the age of 75 actually increased in turnout versus 2020. They had better turnout than 2020. One of the few groups that did that. I was talking about this before the election, talking about silver surge. It was actually something we first talked about in Virginia, going back to, I think it was 2021.
Yeah, Youngkin.
Yeah. And so there was a silver surge for Democrats. Older Democrats were fired up and turned out at that high rate. Younger Democrats did not. They just didn't. Again, the drop off wasn't massive. You're talking about 2.5 point drop off, but it was enough to allow Republicans an opportunity. If you look at Republican turnout by age, you see one thing that's the same and one thing that's different. So the best turnout group among Republicans relative to 2020 was also voters over the age of 75, but they didn't increase by as much as Democrats did. So Democrat seniors were more energized and motivated than Republican seniors. The difference was the next best turnout group for Republicans was voters under the age of 30. They actually matched their 2020 turnout in terms of percent of registration. But to your question of what was happening in registration, their registration had increased by a lot more. So young Republicans accounted for a larger share of the electorate. Here's one point that I think is important to keep in mind as well is we've heard a lot about the Trump campaign efforts to, I forget what people call it, the brosphere or whatever. Yeah, the Joe
Joe
Rogan,
Rogan thing. Yeah.
all that, the Joe Rogan and all the podcasts like that, and all platforms like that, that were made to appeal to young men. Elon Musk is a big part of that. What was interesting to me is though young male Republican turnout was up, young women Republican turnout was actually up slightly more. I
Holy
don't
smokes.
know to what we can attribute that, but that's the thing. When we do this type of analysis, it's not going to give us all the answers. It's going to point us in some directions. It's going to strike down some of the myths that we believe to be true, in the immediate aftermath of the election. And then it's going to set us off on different paths. For me, I think we need to better understand that. You know, these young Democrats who stayed home, I think there are a lot of obvious answers that we could slot in to say this is why. But there's more research to actually dig into that. I think let's bring more data into that equation. And why were these younger voters registering Republican? And why did younger Republican women turn out at an even higher rate, even in the aftermath of Dobbs? And again, I have some theories about that, but I don't think it's worth getting into that here.
Well, we probably want to hear them, but that's okay. We'll let you slide on that. And so we've got a few minutes left, and I don't know if you're going to be able to stay for any of the after chat or not. But what I'd love is, so we're all sort of feeling, I'm not rudderless because I feel like the places that you're pointing us to sort of look for guidance and answers are right. And I feel like what you're telling us now, and based on the data that we'll get, is that you're a trusted source for us to sort of help us understand as grassroots people, we have the ability to pivot a lot faster. So when you sort of think about next steps and you're talking to a grassroots group who have the ability to pivot where we can, what would be some things that you say these are the first things you ought to think about in terms of how you move forward?
Yeah. Well, I think number one, I believed in this before I seen this data. It's something I believe for a long time, and this data just reaffirms for me the grassroots always has been and continues to be the way back. It's the way we win, right? It's having organizing in communities where people are hearing from trusted messengers who they know, or at least they have some level of trust because they share something in common with them. And so the grassroots are incredibly important. I think we need to keep in mind here as we think about the Trump presidency and what he's doing, it has been framed as this great historic victory. And when I look at the data, there wasn't, again, let's keep in mind, turnout overall dropped relative to 2020. He won by just having fewer of his people stay home, but Republican turnout dropped relative to 2020. Both sides turnout dropped. People were not happy with either party for various reasons. They weren't. They felt a level of disconnection. There wasn't this surge of support for Donald Trump that came out to win this election. And even though he won by a massive electoral college margin, when you look at the margins in these states and you look at the story of what happened in Pennsylvania and you say, well, look, if we only had just held the line with voter registration, not done anything special and increased our voter registration, if we just held the line in voter registration and matched them in turnout, we would have won in Pennsylvania. And the same is true across these battleground states. The grassroots does that. We need to invest in it more. That's, to me, the answer. And yes, that doesn't mean that we don't have to do things at the national level. We need to engage at the national level as well in the messaging battle. We need to enter these spaces that we ceded to them. We need to enter in these conversations and engage in these conversations. When you look at the post-election polling data, not just exit polls, but things like the Navigator survey, which I think, if you haven't heard about that already, I think that's coming up. And
it's coming out.
Awesome. Well, that's the good tease for that, because there's such great data in there. You see all of this come out in terms of that people just, what they believe to be true about the parties really drove what happened. And we assumed that people would remember that Trump was a bad president who did bad things. But most Americans don't pay attention at the level we do. And there is this sort of normalcy bias where we just want to believe that things are okay. And he was an avatar for change in the end for a lot of people. That's all. Where they just said, look, I don't like how things are now. He's gonna shake things up. Maybe it'll be better, maybe it'll be worse, but I feel like I need things to change.
So Tom,
And engage in that conversation.
so Tom, one other thing that I just want you to say loud and clear, and that is there was no mandate. And I think that the media sort of right away sort of jumped into that narrative, but it's the one thing I try to say over and over and over again, because that what should give people the courage that they need to do the work we need, because they're thinking that they have all these people who are supporting these horrible, horrible, executive orders, and
Right.
and there's no mandate. So can you just talk about that for just a second before
Yeah,
Carrie
no,
comes on and I see it?
that's absolutely right. Just in terms of the electoral landscape and what it would have taken to swing this election one way or another. This was not a landslide victory. It's not a mandate. And I want to reinforce this again and again and again as we think about the solutions and we talk about these groups that swung. I didn't talk about Latino voters, but even when we look at turnout from Latino voters as a whole did swing very much to Republicans. A lot of what drove that was Latino Democrats stayed home and Latino Republicans had the biggest increases in turnout of any groups. And so, again, that's not, to me, speaking of a mandate for President Trump, it's a mandate for us as Democrats to figure out how do we engage these voters who voted for us last time to come back out. And again, I think that takes you down a very different path than some Democrats are going, where they're saying we've got to go towards Trump and the Republicans. We've got to work with him because he has this mandate. It's not there. The mandate is in re-engaging that base and bringing them back out. It doesn't mean that we can't do the persuasion work as well. We have to do both, and we can, and that's how we win. But we're all talking about the persuasion work. I think a lot of us are forgetting about the engagement work that
The
has.
turnout work.
Yeah,
So
I'm
Tom,
not
yeah,
talking about persuasion work. Go
yeah.
ahead, go ahead,
No,
Catherine.
give me one. I am so excited. I mean, just to listen to, and the important part of this and the piece is what we do with it, right? And the asking the right questions. And you told a really great story, because what we see is elected people just making sometimes the wrong decisions, looking at just 55% turned out. They're looking at the flat, like we talk about just the numbers.
Flatland.
Flatland, who voted, who didn't. And you told a great story about somebody who elected person that was like, maybe I need to go with the Republican, and you really pointed that out. We are also having problem with some of our Democrats we elected voting for this bad immigration bill, because they're just like, oh, I need to get reelected. Can you affirm, I mean, tell us, that's really important for us to know, that that's not the story in these numbers.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'll use Pennsylvania, but Arizona is a great example of this as well. I wrote something about this on my Substack. I appreciate y'all sharing my Substack in your email, by the way, announcing this. Y'all can look at that. I don't write there a lot, but every couple of weeks I'll write something. I wrote something about Arizona, but in Pennsylvania, we'll see this. And I'm not calling out Senator Fetterman specifically for this, but I don't mean to call him out. I think he's done a lot of good things, but we've seen where he has made some more conservative statements lately. And I think a lot of people said, well, look, Pennsylvania swung. Therefore, he has to, if he's thinking about reelection, he has to move in that direction. And now that we have the Pennsylvania data, we know, well, the reason that Pennsylvania swung is because Dems stayed home. And so I think if you look at that in that context, Catherine, you'd say, well, is that really the smartest move for him politically? Like, is what he is doing going to fire up those Democrats who stayed home, those young Democrats who decided they didn't want to participate? Are they going to look at this and say, okay, now I see myself as a Democrat and I'm going to vote? I don't think so.
Nope.
And so again, and I don't, I hesitate to name him, but I think it's a helpful example in terms of what Democrats are facing. And Catherine, to your point, how people are maybe misreading this, and we
Reading
need
it.
to be a little bit smarter about it.
Yeah, and because I feel like if we want to win the House in 2 years, we have a lot of people dissatisfied about what they're reading the numbers wrong. I want to hand it to Carrie, because I would like us to get Brian in the room and maybe have a second where to introduce you to Brian Rolling. So Carrie, I'm going to hand it over to you. Tom, if you have a few minutes to stay.
Thanks.
Sure.
Tom, I'm so glad you mentioned that Navigator survey, because I read Brian Rolling's Substack where he really unpacked that Navigator survey. This is Brian. He is the author
Nice to
and
meet you.
co-founder of Murmur, and he writes a Substack. So say hello.
Yeah, and I actually, Brian, they shared your Substack with me, and I read, which I think is why it was front of mind. I love what you've done, so I'm looking forward.
That is beyond flattering because I've stolen from your Twitter feed multiple times in Substack. So thank you.
Bringing people together. That's what the grassroots are all about. That's what we always say.
It's good to meet
Well,
you.
Brian,
Likewise.
yeah, great. So yeah,
you,
the
Tom.
two of you kind of, working from the same playbook here. I just love that Tom got into the data. Brian has been focusing on more of the messaging and understanding.